Hey everybody, it's Curse, and today I'm going to bless you with my plans for Last Epoch 1.0 launch. I am almost certain now that I'm going to be playing Warlock, and I'm going to walk you through the first build that I plan on testing out. And it certainly looks like this build is going to be amazing. The damage estimates that I have so far look incredible, but by far, the greatest strength for the build is going to be its survivability. We stack high ward, high armor, absolutely through the roof dodge, multiple different damage reduction sources. This is going to be one of the tankiest builds in the game. And of course, keep in mind that we're basing this build guide off of the current state of the game based on what we have seen from the Falconer and Warlock reveals, and we don't have full visibility on the 1.0 patch. So nothing is 100% confirmed, but if everything stays as it is, this is most likely the build that I'm going to be running. Also keep in mind that I am not a community tester, so I haven't played Warlock at all. I have pretty much the same information that all of you have that have seen the reveal videos as well as the build planners, but nothing else. And sometimes skills don't interact the exact same way we imagine based on just seeing a 1-minute video or just reading the skill nodes. So part of this build will be up to testing things out. However, I've put a lot of thought into this build. I've calculated a lot of the potential defensive and damage numbers, and I'm fairly confident that this should be a solid build. And given how we have a lot more newer players coming into Last Epoch, this video is going to contain the extensive late game build guide, and I'm going to create a separate video that will go over Acolyte and Warlock early game leveling. I don't think I should be trying to fit both of them into a single video. It's just too much information to cover. Anyway, I'm super hyped for 1.0 and for Warlock. I hope you are as well. And so if you're thinking about starting Warlock, check this build out, and I hope you won't be disappointed. Irashaimase! So let's start with the build planner over here. Going into skills, at a high level, our main source of DPS is going to be Chthonic Fissure. For mobility, we're going to use Ghostflame, and then Chaos Bolt, Rip Blood, and Bone Curse are going to be utility. So starting with Chthonic Fissure, our main damage source, we're going to be relying not on the spirits, not on the actual fissures damage over time, but on the damage coming from the Torment Curse, which is inflicted by the spirits that come out of the fissure. And the best way to scale that damage is with Twisted Waves right here, this node. It gives us 3% more multiplicative damage for every 2% necrotic res. It is fairly easy to get like 500% necrotic res, so this is an 8 times multiplier right there. It's absolutely crazy. Really strong node right here. It makes Torment, which is essentially kind of like an ailment of sorts with a stack limit of 1. It makes it so it might actually be viable for a source of DPS. Grimtide is another great multiplier right here. It gives Chthonic Fissure and ailments it inflicts more necrotic damage per 1% crit multi. And the Curse Torment is necrotic based, so this should work on it. It is also considered an ailment, and it is also considered a spell. So Chthonic Fissure should have it counted as an ailment that is applied by Chthonic Fissure. So this node should apply to it. However, it does require testing. And in terms of the power we get from this, you can easily get 200% crit multi in this game. So this is a 3 times multiplier for the damage from Torment. And then if we continue on the left, we get necrotic res shred stacks, 2 per spirit. So this is easily going to max the necrotic res on bosses, for example, up to 10. So we won't need any other sources of necrotic res shred. That is always beautiful. Extra spirits from this node. And then this is a really cool node that allows us to proc Chaos Bolts. And Chaos Bolts carry tons of utility in them. However, you have to keep in mind that Chaos Bolt mana consumption is still there at 60% of the value. And any Chaos Bolt that you proc is going to replace your spirits. So this is not going to be an issue versus bosses where your spirits, you just need 1 spirit to hit the boss, and you're going to apply Torment every single time. And even against a large group of enemies, it should still be okay because Chaos Bolts should be able to clear trash just as well as Torment. 2 other nodes that give us great multiplicative damage bonuses is this one for 45% at 3 points to Torment, and then this one right here gives us essentially 16% more damage per point. So This one could be better, especially in the late game when rares and bosses might be the bigger problem. So you can definitely consider taking these 4 points out, plugging them into here, and even having maybe an extra point for death from below for even more damage. And now this one of Gloom and Flames is a node I'm not 100% certain as to whether we're going to use it or not. We're going to have to test whether or not we have enough mana sustain to utilize this. Like I said, we have to play the game a little bit, get used to Warlock, get used to Chthonic Fissure, and see how it goes before we can commit to the exact skill tree. A few other notes is this Torment duration is not really necessary. Our spirits are going to be applying Torment all the time, so you really don't need Torment duration. There's a maximum stack of 1. Duration for ailments is generally more viable and more beneficial if you have an unlimited number of stacks for that type of ailment. And now that we've gone over our main source of DPS, Chthonic Fissure, we can talk about Ghostflame, which is one of the tankiest skills in the game. It's absolutely crazy. And basically with it, you want to beeline into Spirit of Dread, which allows you to not only channel the spell, but also move while you're channeling it and move at a higher move speed than normal. You get plus 20% MS. You can bump that up to 150% of your base MS. Channel cost is higher, but we can mitigate that with Spectral Menace, which reduces channel cost by 70%. And I'm not sure how these multiplicative numbers will work, whether some of them are additive and some of them are multiplicative. So we'll have to check that out. But Spectral Menace is also very nice because it gives us ward while channeling based on our current mana. And with this build, you'll see later on how much mana we're going to have. And this is going to be a fairly significant source of ward. And that's not the only reason that this build is going to be insanely tanky. We have a Wraith form right here. I'm not sure why the numbers are so crazy high for this node, but just imagine having 100 intelligence. With 100 int, this gives you 4,000 dodge times 2. So that's 8,000 dodge. 8,000 dodge is pretty close to the cap of 85% dodge chance. So even just 100 int, which is very easy to achieve, gives you insane dodge for your Ghostflame channeling. Just keep in mind that when you stop channeling, you have a 0.8 second cooldown, and you will be vulnerable during that duration. You can also convert that dodge to armor. I prefer going with dodge, and I'll explain a little bit more on that later when we go into the EHP calculator towards the end of the video. But on top of what we've seen so far, we also have Disdain, which is a 40% damage reduction while channeling. Absolutely phenomenal node. Make sure to get it as well. And that is where we land with 20 skill points. If you can get a +2 to Ghostflame, I would take 1 point out of Wraith form and pop it into Enfeebled Prey. That will give you another 20% damage reduction, so you will be even tankier. And like I mentioned earlier, hitting max dodge is trivial if you stack enough intelligence. So you can definitely take 1 point out of there, or even 1 point out of the movement speed. You're going to have pretty high MS. Anyway, you have options in order to hit this +2. The only issue that we might run into is mana sustain because of the high mana cost of Fissure, 45. Plus the high mana cost of running Ghostflame. Not to mention that we don't regen mana during Ghostflame. So that's why you want to think about some sources of mana regeneration. And that's why we're going to Chaos Bolts next. Great utility skill. The most important things to note here are it gives us health as well as 2 mana per hit on cursed enemies, and pretty much every single enemy is going to be cursed around us. So this node should pay for every single Chaos Bolt cast. In the late game, I suspect we're never going to be going into our HP pool, so the health gain will be absolutely useless. But other than that, we also want to proc Rip Blood per point of intelligence. We want to proc Bone Curse on cursed enemies, so make sure you have this node as well. A little bit of extra health gain per curse here. And we also can proc Harvest if we invest a little bit in dexterity. And with this build, investing in like 2 or 3 affixes for dexterity is not too hard. So we should easily be able to hit, let's say, 30 dex, which makes this a very viable node. After that, I would get Seed of Chaos for even more Chaos Bolts. Why not? A little bit of extra area because we want to make sure our Chaos Bolts hit the enemies as much as possible. If only 1 of 3 of them hits a single enemy, that's not going to give us as much mana. It's not going to give us as many procs. So this is just ensuring that we have a higher chance of hitting the enemies. The fear chance might be annoying, however, and if that's the case, we just take this out. A little bit of Ignite and Damn chance over here just for extra ailments. And then next we have Rib Blood. So Rib Blood, if you remember, it's getting procced by Chaos Bolt, so it's free damage. Not only is it free damage, but it's free ward as well, based on this node, plus this node that converts the essentially 30 health into 15 ward per rip blood. So between the 3 rip bloods per second, this should give us 45 ward per second. I think pretty easily against single target especially. And then there are 2 nodes that are dependent on directly casting rip blood. Arcane Absorption is one, and Mana Feast is another. We're rarely going to be casting rip blood directly unless we're fighting a tankier enemy. So this is what rip blood is for. It's for single target damage. You stop and you boost all of your spell damage by casting 5 or 10 rip bloods. 5 rip bloods is 40 spell damage and 45 mana gained. So it's an excellent source of just mana sustain and extra DPS. But again, this is only going to be for boss fights. I highly doubt we're going to need it for clear. And finally, we have Curse. The primary purpose of Curse is to get Mark for Death, which is a 25% necrotic damage penetration essentially. We give it extra duration. We convert the skill to necrotic. Those are not too significant, but also we can get kill threshold. That's kind of nice. And then the remainder, we try to get a little bit of bone armor proc for a tiny extra bit of survivability, and the rest we dump into extra damage. So that is the Bone Curse setup. It's just simple utility for Mark for Death. We don't have any other source for Mark for Death. It's kind of hard to proc it in general with Warlock, it looks like. But Bone Curse is also an extra source of a curse. And if you remember, the passive bonus for Warlock is 5% more damage per curse on the target. It's going to be a little bit of extra damage, probably 25 to 30% more damage for your Warlock fissures. So now that we've gone over the skills, let's talk about itemization, because we know what we want to accomplish with our skills. When it comes to itemization, there are no core must-have uniques. However, there are 3 very strong uniques that I would recommend integrating into the build. The first one is Bone Clamor Barbute. We're already going to be stacking necrotic resistance, and you can see I have 944 right now, and it's primarily because of the Twisted Waves passive that gives us more damage per necrotic res. There's insane synergy with Bone Clamor Barbute for this build. We also like dexterity, we like intelligence stacking, we even like the armor it gives us. This is the perfect item for the build. I would even go so far as recommending for you to use your first runes of ascendances on helmets, just to try and get a Bone Clamor. It's going to be a huge boost for both survivability and DPS for the build. If you get lucky and get 1 or 2 LP Bone Clamor, you want to get into necrotic res, whichever one you want to put for tier 7. I like intelligence, but necrotic res is an option as well. Another great unique is Telfune's Mirage. We are going for an int stacking build, and also we're going to be channeling all the time. So this item synergizes quite well with channeling, gives you dodge rating while channeling, increased dodge rating while channeling, ward gained when you dodge while channeling, mana gained when you dodge. And the effective level for LP for a boot is actually not that bad. So you should be able to get a 2 LP Telfune eventually. It's also a common drop, so you should be able to get a bunch of Telfune Mirages, even a 0 LP. You might want to just throw it on there, especially early game. It's going to give you tons of survivability until you get your intelligence stacked up pretty highly to take advantage of the dodge rating from the Ghostflame skill tree. The other unique I have is Mad Alchemist Ladle, and this unique is tricky because it's quite strong and it could easily get nerfed with 1.0, so we may need to assess whether or not we keep it once we see the patch notes, and I will update the build planner as soon as I see the patch notes, so don't worry about that. The item itself gives us a lot. The spell damage is low. However, we do get 8% more spell damage, which is multiplicative per negative ailment on the target. Essentially, every single curse that we apply is considered a negative ailment. We also have multiple easily sourced negative ailments on top of that, like Damned, Ignite, and then 5 extra sources of ailments right here from the item itself. So without heavy investment, you can get 10 to 20 negative ailments. So 80 to 160% more damage multiplier. And that easily compensates for the low spell damage on the item. And we can get a few more sources of spell damage, and I'll talk a little bit about that later as well. But this line right here is great for the build as well. We're already stacking int because int synergizes with just so many different elements in the build. And if you can get 150 to 200 int, that is 75 to 100% cast speed. So we'll see if this line survives the patch or if it gets nerfed. I think this is probably the biggest offender for why this item is so OP. But yeah, I'm not going to say no to 100% increased cast speed, even though I'm not running a high cast speed build. We're going to be channeling all the time and zooming around on our skates with Ghostflame. It even has a little bit of mana, and as you noticed, there is some synergy between mana and ward generation for this build. So this is the perfect item for the build. If you don't have it, just a rare wand is fine. But once you get it, you probably want to spec into crit multi and either cast speed or necrotic damage or damage over time. Spell damage is also an option. You have a lot of good options for what prefixes you want to throw in there. The reason why I'm avoiding some of those percent damage bonuses is because we're going to be stacking intelligence so heavily. And those percent damage, let's say necrotic damage increase, is additive with the percent damage increase for int. So if we have 200 int, let's say, that gives us 800% extra necrotic damage. And so if you have another 100% damage over time from the one prefix, that's only going to push you up from 800 bonus to 900 bonus. And we're going to have a bunch of other sources of percent increased damage. So it gets heavily diluted. Very much diminishing returns to scale when it comes to those percent increase because they're not multiplicative. And those are the three uniques that I would recommend. Beyond that, in terms of itemization, what you want to get onto your affixes is just int, necrotic res, crit multi, a little bit of cast speed, and then just maxing out your defensive layers. Our itemization is made incredibly simple because of the synergies between these two nodes, as well as other items and skills and bonuses benefiting from necrotic res, for example. So I would strongly recommend for you to get necrotic res on every single item slot in the game. Starting with chest piece, you can see I have necrotic res and I have tier 7 int. And the other prefix I want to highlight is mana gained when you use on harvest. That affix is only available in chest pieces, and it might be necessary if we struggle with mana sustain, given that harvest is going to be procced by Chaos Bolt thanks to this node right here and thanks to us having roughly 30 dexterity. So every time you proc harvest, you might gain 13 to 15 mana. Now, I don't know whether it's going to work because it says when you use harvest. So I'm not sure whether that implies directly use harvest or indirectly proc harvest. So this is up to testing. It's also dependent on whether or not we actually need that mana. We have a bunch of other sources of mana sustain. We still have to run those tests and see how the build feels. Let's also talk a little bit about why I choose to go tier 7 int and not tier 7 necrotic res. And the reason for it is when you look at int, going from tier 5 to tier 7 doubles the amount of power that you get from this affix. When you look at necrotic res, going from tier 5 to tier 7 doesn't quite double the power. If it were double, it would be 136% necrotic res at tier 7. So because of that, I think the returns to going from tier 5 to tier 7 are better on intelligence instead of going for necrotic res tier 7. But if you want to go tier 7 necrotic, it is an option. It will give you a lot of damage. Intelligence is probably the more well-rounded choice because it gives you not only damage but also survivability. Necrotic res does give us a bit more survivability as well because of the Barbute getting ward per second for necrotic res. However, I think intelligence is going to be far more survivability overall versus necrotic res. And implicit, I would recommend all res just to make the itemization easier. For offhand, again, I recommend necrotic res. For the prefixes, I would go for crit multi and increase dot, or increase necrotic or increase spell. Those three are interchangeable for what we're doing. And crit multi, as you can see, is again double the value from tier 5 to tier 7. So that's the reason we're going for it rather than for necrotic res. And I just want to highlight that crit multi will give you more damage overall versus necrotic res tier 7. But if you want to go for a little bit of extra survivability and sacrifice a little bit of damage, definitely switch to tier 7 necrotic res and tier 5 crit multi. It's a viable option that doesn't change the build up significantly. You'll notice I have an open suffix and that I've left that on purpose. That is basically a flex suffix just to max out your res. I've done the same for other item slots as well. Just utilize those as you wish. Either get plus health or plus res or whatever you want. For amulet, we go for tier 7 necrotic pen as well as tier 5 crit multi and of course the necrotic res. And we have the flex suffix here as well. Also notice the implicits for this bone amulet. Necrotic res, perfect for the build, and phys res for an easy max on our physical resistances. Bone amulet is the great choice for this build. For ring, the ivory ring implicit is best with necrotic res again and word retention. Prefixes, we want int dex with tier 7 int and of course necrotic res with a flex suffix. The other ring is the exact same. For belt, the most important thing on the belt is getting your reduced bonus damage taken from critical strikes. And this will take a while to farm up, but as soon as you get this belt, you're in a good spot. For the remaining affixes, because the prefixed percent increased necrotic damage is not nearly as important as percent necrotic res, so prioritize the necrotic res if you can. And between this tier 7 hybrid armor on the belt and the tier 5 hybrid armor on the chest, we max out our crit mitigation. So that is our crit mitigation, is these 2 item slots. Gloves are simple as well. Tier 7 and tier 5 necrotic res and tier 5 mana for prefix. You could also go for tier 5 cast speed is okay. Tier 5 necrotic or dot or spell damage. So those are all good options. I chose mana here just for a little bit of extra ward generation. If you recall, we have ward generated per current mana on our Ghostflame ability. The implicit on the gloves is just extra armor and void res. Pretty straightforward. Void res can be maxed out with just this implicit. Nice and easy because of how much all res we're running already. For the relic, necrotic damage implicit is solid. Another great option for implicit is cursed bones. This gives us increased curse damage, 63%. It's very comparable. The fire res is nice, however, because we don't have fire res maxed out by default. You can do either one of those. They're pretty interchangeable. Our main DPS source is Torment, like we said, and that is considered a curse. For affixes, we again run tier 7 in, tier 5 crit multi, and tier 5 necrotic res with an open suffix. I also like to run a sealed chance to apply frailty on hit. Tier 1 is more than enough. So either getting on the amulet, relic, or glove, any one of those slots is perfect. It's quite nice for boss fighting. We already do so many hits from all the Chaos Bolt procs, all the Spirit procs. So you're going to have 3 stacks on bosses at all times. So between all of these item slots, we're running 6 open suffixes. And that is how you max all these res. It's trivial, basically. Because of how much all res we're already running. So just make sure that you get those res maxed out. In terms of idols, I was very surprised. Generally, I love to run HP idols. However, with this build, I don't think we're ever going to be needing those HP idols. We're going to be running 15 to 20,000 stable ward. So instead of those HP idols, we can just run more damage over time and necrotic res idols and ignore HP altogether. Invest in even more necrotic res on these humbled 2x1 idols. Or alternatively, you can use your idols to max out some of the res. Just keep in mind that EHG will release additional idol prefixes and suffixes for Warlock. So it could be that we get a new best in slot idol for this specific playstyle, especially things to do with curses. I suspect they'll release something. So we just have to wait and see how that turns out. Once we know more, we'll update the idols. A similar comment goes about helm and chest piece. EHG should be adding new prefixes that are Warlock specific, but we don't know what they're going to be. We don't know whether one of them could be potentially best in slot for this build. So we just have to wait and see, but this is the best we can do with the current information that we have. For blessings, they're pretty straightforward. Crit multi for Black Sun, mana for ending the storm, because mana gets turned into ward, as you recall. All res from Reign of Dragons. And if you haven't seen my recent series for build making guides, I discussed in great length why I prefer 20% all res over 70% critical strike avoidance for this blessing. I strongly believe that 20% all res is optimal here for the late game. Critical strike avoidance may be better when you're just entering into the 8 game where you're like level 70, level 80, level 90. But as you acquire more loot and you optimize your character, you want to go for 20% all res. And then for the last 2 nodes, you want to optimize your armor with 70% increased armor here and 750 armor while channeling from this blessing. Finally, let's go over the passive skill tree. And if you're unsure as to the order in which you want to be picking up some of these, don't worry about it. I'm going to release a separate video that is more tailored towards leveling with this exact build and with just Acolyte and Warlock in general. I just don't want to try and fit too much into a single video. Today we're focusing on the late game of this build, and that's going to include 20 points exactly into the Acolyte base class. Ain't stacking, very important. Necrotic resistance plus ward retention, and then a little bit of vitality for survivability. And don't forget that 6 vitality is 6% necrotic res as well. It's not too bad. Then we go into the Warlock passive skill tree. Soul Stealer is likely going to be a decent source of mana. Chance per curse to gain mana on hit. Given how many hits we're going to be proccing, this should easily proc once every 3 to 3.5 seconds to give us roughly 4 mana per second. That will help quite a bit given how mana hungry this build is. Next, you really want to get as much spell damage from your passive skill tree as possible because we're running Mad Alchemist Lato, so we do not have high spell damage. Make sure to max Unholy Torment as well as Duskbringer for more spell damage here for curses. Then we focus more on instacking with Occultist Mind and Malefic Body. These 3 nodes in the middle are kind of neat as well. Very good survivability coming from them. This one in particular gives us ward per second per 2 intelligence while channeling. And if you recall, we have roughly 200 int if everything is optimized, and that's 500 ward per second. And we're going to be channeling as much as possible, by the way. Imperishable is strong as well, because it gives us ward decay threshold per necrotic res. And we have like 1,000 necrotic res. That's 1,000 ward decay threshold. Pretty good node right here. Doom Herald, another phenomenal survivability, but also damage multiplier node. If you cast your Chthonic Fissure and then start channeling right away, all of your torment damage is going to get multiplied by 1.24, and you're going to be taking 24% less damage as well, on top of all of the other damage reduction multipliers that we have. A source of Wither is a must-have. Wither is an ailment that increases the damage that enemies take from curses by 10%, and it can stack up to 20 times. At max stacks, that's 200% increased damage taken from curses, which is a 3 times multiplier. Absolutely must have node right here. You might be able to get away with fewer points in it if you don't care about the 8% less damage taken from withered enemies. If 1 or 2 points is sufficient, I might reallocate 3 or 4 of these points into other nodes. 7-point investment for 40 crit multi is not phenomenal, but this is the only source of crit multi that we have on our skill tree, so we take advantage of it. And then at the bottom, I already mentioned the spell damage for curses. The last passive node that we have is Fleeting Crone, and I would really like to have 5 points in it. Unfortunately, I'm not sure where to take them from. I'm sure I'll move things around and probably end up with 5 points in here just to get 50% increased haste effect. We want to be running 100% uptime on haste. For the Lich skill tree, we want to get another 10 int for the int stacking. 60% necrotic damage is very strong here. This is our only source of spell damage leech. Truly, we do not need spell damage leech, so if you feel more comfortable, you can put those 5 points into Bed of Souls as well. I'm gonna have to test that out, but I suspect I might move those to here. And then finally, we have exactly 8 points to put into 16 intelligence. We don't care about health regen reduction because we're never going to be relying on our health pool. And now that we've covered all of the items, skill setup, idle blessing, and passive setup, let's talk a little bit about how this build is going to play out. How I see it working is in 2 different ways. And let's talk about one being monoliths clearing, and then the second one is going to be bossing. When it comes to monos, you're going to be casting Chthonic Fissure and then just zooming away with Ghostflame. That's it. You don't want to be casting Chaos Bolts. You don't want to be casting Riblood. You don't want to be casting Bone Curse. We will make sure to have Transplant equipped on your skill bar instead of Chaos Bolts. So that's a little bit of extra mobility that you can utilize every now and then. And keep in mind that for some reason, currently, Ghostflame is not labeled as a traversal skill. I think it will likely end up being a traversal skill when the game launches, but until then, just consider that it won't share a cooldown with Transplant. So that's pretty straightforward. We Chthonic Fissure and we skate away with Ghostflame without worrying about too much else in monos. Just be cautious in that 1 second cooldown with Ghostflame. Your survivability drops significantly when you're not running Ghostflame, so just be careful around that. Now, when it comes to boss fighting, we can afford to stand still and just cast Riblood and get as many stacks of Arcane Absorption as possible. With the high cast speed that we get from Mad Alchemist Ladle and the 200 int that we have, this is going to be a really good synergy. You could easily triple to quadruple your damage just by spamming Riblood before you cast your Fissure. You still want to Ghostflame, especially when you see a massive attack coming at you from the boss. You don't want to just cast Riblood. Just use Riblood occasionally to get extra damage and be aware of the boss damage mechanics. So that's it. Pretty straightforward, I think. From playstyle, it's going to be super smooth in monos. Movement speed is going to be insane. Clear should be great. Boss fights should be solid and reliable. It's not going to be the most single target damage in the world, but it should be good enough that we don't need to worry about boss fights. And the tankiness is going to make boss fights kind of trivial as well. And now let's go over the stats for the build also. We're running 200 int, like I said, 30 dex, 30 vit. This mana here is not accurate. The build planner is not working as intended. It should be roughly 500. We don't have much health, but we don't care about that. I'll do a quick calc of our ward per second right away here. We're going to have max res thanks to all of the flex suffix slots. We're running 50% armor mitigation from armor. We're going to be running a lot more dodge than this. Like I said, roughly 40,000 dodge from just the int here. Max crit damage reduction, 1,000 ward retention. We're also going to be running 280 crit multi, which is a 3.8 times multiplier for our torment damage. Solid cast speed. And now let's take a quick look at how much ward we're going to be generating per second. We're going to have, like I said, 500 ward per second from this node. Roughly, let's say 300 or maybe 250 ward per second from this Bone Climber Barbute. This node right here is going to give us another 250 to 300 ward per second, as long as we can maintain our mana close to max. So that gives us roughly 1,000 ward per second. On top of that, we have another 50 from the focus, another 45 per second from our 3 Rip Bloods that are going to be procced by Chaos Bolts. So that puts us roughly at 1,100 ward per second. On top of that, we have, let's say, 1,000 ward decay threshold between these two nodes, because we have roughly 1,000 necrotic res. So if we put all of that into the ward calculator, let's say we have 1,000 ward decay threshold, 1,100 ward per second, and let's take our ward retention down to 900, just to be a little bit more conservative. In the ultra late game, you can definitely attain some of these numbers. So you can see, based on those 3 parameters, we're gonna be running 16,000 stable ward. That is a crazy high amount if you're channeling all the time, of course. As soon as you stop channeling, a lot of your ward per second generation goes down. So make sure to have a high uptime on your channeling, especially during monos. And now let's take a look at our survivability, our effective HP based off of that ward amount. I've plugged in 1,100 HP, 15,000 ward, just to be slightly conservative, 3,000 armor, which is 50% DR versus physical damage. Didn't touch the endurance max res, obviously. And then we have 24% DR from the Doom Herald passive, 40% DR from Ghostflame Disdain node, 20% DR from Ghostflame Enfeebled Prey node, 8% DR from the 5 points in the Wither passive. And we have additional sources of damage reduction like Frailty, Bone Armor is another one, but I didn't want to go overboard, so let's just keep it at these 4. And then we have Dodge. And at 40,000 dodge rating, or you can put it at 30,000, it doesn't really matter, you have 84.3% dodge chance. So altogether, what all of this means for the build is we're running average EHP of 600k. EHP versus one-shots is great as well, 90,000. You're not going to be dying to one-shots. And then dodge is going to ensure that you're incredibly survivable overall. EHP versus non-physical damage is great as well. And so this is why I believe this will be one of the tankiest builds in the entire game, which will allow it to push very high in corruption. High EHP versus one-shots is what you truly need for high corruption pushing. Obviously, damage is a requirement as well, but we should be okay on the damage side, especially for clear. And now let's quickly talk for a second about why dodge and not armor conversion. For Ghostflame right here, you can convert your dodge to armor while channeling. Let's say that we switch dodge into armor. Let's see what happens. So we bring the dodge down to 0, and let's say we get 30,000 armor. Our EHP is way lower, and that's kind of to be expected, but our EHP versus one-shots is 3 times higher. So we're trading off one-shot EHP versus average EHP. And normally, if you've seen some of my other videos, I'm not a huge fan of dodge, feast or famine mechanics like that, and I'm always leaning towards armor. However, in this case, because we're going to be running 15,000 ward, our EHP versus one-shots is going to be fine either way. We're never going to die to one-shots. And that's why I'm heavily leaning towards dodge compared to going into armor. Not to mention that if you go into non-physical damage, the picture is much worse. The average EHP for the armor build is far worse. It's not even comparable. And the EHP versus one-shots is not too different. If this happened to be some sort of HP build where we're at like 3,000 to 4,000 HP, I would probably be leaning towards running armor instead of dodge, just to make sure that we survive those one-shots. But that is my argument here. That's why I prefer 3,000 armor and 30,000 dodge. So that is the build that I'm most excited to try in 1.0. I really hope it works out exactly as I envision it. But if it doesn't, we will pivot and find something even better. Who knows? Another cool aspect of the build is that Bone Curse is not really mandatory, and it can be a flexible skill slot that you can change to whatever you feel like. If something else fits your playstyle better, you can go wild and try whatever you want. Anyway, let me know what you think of the build in the comments below, and I guess we'll see how it performs in about a week and a half. If you enjoyed the build guide, you can check me out on Twitch as well. I will be playing Warlock as soon as 1.0 hits, so come and check out the progression and let's see how long it takes to hit level 100. And stay tuned for my next 2 videos where I'll be covering Acolyte and Warlock early gameplay. One of the videos will contain build planners for what I intend to run for the first 50 levels, and the other video will contain the actual gameplay. I'll be using Lich to substitute for Warlock, but the gameplay I suspect will not be significantly different, especially based on what I'm planning on running. And I'll optimize it for speed running while also maintaining a high level as much as possible, with the intent of hitting level 100 as early as possible. Anyways, take it easy and go chiso sama deshita.